Oh,
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here to the 2023 Reischauer Lecture. My name is Mark Wu. I am the director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, and I want to start by first thanking the Asia Center, the Reischauer Institute, the Korea Institute, as well as all of the other regional centers who provided support for the Reischauer Lecture. Let me say a few words about the Reischauer Lecture, because it truly is one of the times when we draw on the legacy of one of the pioneers of East Asian studies here at Harvard and provide a 3-day lecture series that highlights themes that cut across different regions in East Asia. The lecture was established in 1986 to honor the late Professor and Ambassador Edwin O. Reischauer. Professor Reischauer served on the faculty here at Harvard for many years, including serving as a director for the Harvard Qing Institute and as the founder of the Japan Institute, which now has his name, the Reischauer Institute. He was, of course, not just a teacher and a scholar and one of the most prominent thinkers about shaping Americans' views on Japan at a critical time during World War II and the reconstruction of Japan afterwards, including its transformation into an American ally. But he was also deeply involved in shaping U.S. public policy towards East Asia overall. He served a stint having been ambassador to Japan, appointed by President Kennedy in 1961. And then, of course, he returned here to Harvard to continue his scholarly work. So we at the Fairbanks Center have named this lecture series for him and offer this 3-day series to really draw out ideas over the years of leading thinking in various different areas, particularly focused on humanities that draw on the tradition and the inspiration from Professor Reischauer's life and work. And so it's really with great pleasure that I have to welcome all of you back for the first in-person Reischauer Lecture in 4 years. This is an event I could say we literally have been waiting 3 years for, and I have the benefit of welcoming to campus Professor Angela Leung KG, sorry. She serves as the chair professor of history, as well as the Joseph Needham Philip Mao professor in Chinese history and science and civilization at the University of Hong Kong. She's also director of the university's Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences and has served in that role since 2011. She has taught history at a number of institutions, including UCLA, National Taiwan University, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She was elected an academician of the Academic Syndicat in 2010. She has published numerous articles in English, Chinese, and French on the Ming-Qing period, as well as on modern periods. She earned her PhD in the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and then served as a researcher at Academia Sinica in Taiwan in 1982 before embarking on her illustrious academic career. And she has touched and written on many different themes, which are using a theme like leprosy to draw out so many different dimensions of what is happening, both historically, but also as a lens and a reflection of what's happening in the contemporary context. And we're really excited to use soy sauce as that lens over the next 3 days to understand and enrich ourselves in this tradition as well. Our discussant today is our own Professor Victor Hsiao. Victor Hsiao is the Assistant Professor of History of Science here at Harvard University. He is a historian of technology, science, and industry specializing in modern China and Japan. So certainly, again, drawing on the themes that cut across from Professor Reischauer's own work here in East Asian Studies. And he's focused particularly on the histories of technology, work, and society. So certainly we couldn't think of a better discussant to kick off the series and the themes that Professor Leung is going to highlight for us today. I'll also just note that Professor Sale's latest book, Carbon Technology, is the winner of the 29th John Whitney Prize awarded by the Association of Asian Studies. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Angela Leung, and we look forward to the next 3 days of the Reischauer Lectures.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Many thanks to the Fairbanks Center for inviting me to deliver this year's Reischauer Lectures, and special thanks to Michael Soni, who first invited me back in 2020, just before COVID, to deliver the lectures. Of course, that plan was interrupted by COVID, and finally I could do it this year, and I feel extremely grateful. Also thanks to Mark Wu and Dinda Elliott for organizing the event this year. It has been an incredibly difficult 3 years, but I think it's worth the waiting, and it's heartwarming to see many old friends in Cambridge after these difficult years. I was invited to give the lectures in early 2020, even though it was interrupted by COVID. I'm grateful that I could finally do this now. In early 2020, I was beginning to conceptualize a book on the history of soy sauce. And today, I'm at the stage of finishing the last chapters of the book on the history of soy sauce. And I'm particularly grateful to be given the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and findings with you, and will be even more grateful to you to receive your criticism and comments. I thank in particular to Victor Siu, Michael Soni, and Susan Greenhart for taking the time to discuss my talks for the 3 days. The idea of writing a history of soy sauce began when I was building a research team on everyday technology and the making of modern East Asia back in around 2015, 2016. At that time, I was planning to work on the construction of nutritional science in modern China, a topic that I've been working on for some time at that moment. But as I was dutifully going through Republican archival materials at the Institute of Modern History of the Academia Sinica, I was quickly drawn to an amazing collection of documents related to the industrialization of traditional foods in China, including soy sauce, vinegar, jiu, and so on and so forth, in the 1930s and in the 1920s and 30s, that revealed intriguing aspects of modern Chinese history that were crying for more in-depth study. So I immediately plunged into this new adventure. And looking back from the modern industrial moment, I see the meaning and value of soy sauce in imperial China in new light. And I also understand better its post-industrial fate in different parts of East Asia. Later, after many site visits in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, China, and South Korea. My 3 lectures are based on the first half of my book that discusses the history of soy sauce up to the end of the Second World War. The second half of my book will be on the more contemporary period. I'm truly honored and privileged to have the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this topic with you at this stage of my book writing. So if you go to any supermarket today in any East Asian city, or even in Western city, you go to supermarket, you go to shelves of selling condiments. This is something you see almost everywhere. Soy sauces are sold everywhere at relatively cheap prices. Soy sauce has become a very banal condiment. The banality of soy sauce as a condiment in Chinese and East Asian cuisines and its accessibility as a global commodity do not naturally inspire the study of its history. Many Chinese tend to believe that it is as ageless as Chinese civilization itself. Even after the seminal study on the history of Chinese fermented food by H.T. Huang back in the year 2000, which is one of the most, to me, which is perhaps the most successful books in the Needham's Chinese Science and Civilization series. I have given 1 or 2 talks in China on the history of soy sauce, commenting on the earliest mentions of the soy sauce in Chinese called jiangyou in 13th century recipe text, song text. A typical reaction from the audiences was skepticism on this quote and unquote late dating of the mentions. Sometimes my audiences quoted archaeological findings that would suggest earlier existence of soy sauce under different names or in some kind of version of soy sauce. A common advertising slogan of big Chinese soy sauce businesses is the quote and unquote 3,000 years of history of Chinese soy sauce. Such putative assumption reflects how firmly the idea of soy sauce is ingrained in the imagination of an ancient, uninterrupted Chinese tradition. Ishige Naomichi, the leading Japanese food ethnologist, made an insightful observation some years ago that soy sauce delineates East Asia as a cultural sphere. And I hope that idea fits my talks into the Reischauer Lecture series. His remarks would be strongly backed by this popular notion of soy sauce being a symbol of Chinese civilization or East Asian civilization, while the condiment's cultural identifying power easily denies it of its historicity. My 3 lectures pieces together the history of Chinese soy sauce precisely to explain its power as an everyday food. I traced the product's trajectory from an obscure condiment for the elite to a popular everyday food in the Qing and early Republican period, to explain its fate inextricably linked with that of a Chinese nation striving toward modernity. It was during its relatively recent history that I believe soy sauce acquired the power that we are familiar with today. But first, let us clarify, what is soy sauce? The condiment in Chinese, of course, most of you here know that it's called jiangyou. In northern China and shiyou in southern China. The use of soybean as the main ingredient, curiously, is obvious only in the English language. We call it soy sauce. But if you look at jiangyou, it's not clear. It's made from soybean. And shiyou, despite the use of the radical of bean, it's uncertain whether it's soybean or other kinds of bean. The condiment can in fact be made with other legumes or grain than soybean. Jiang can also be made from meat. We all know that this condiment, we know all this condiment too well, with its unique color that you can see in the picture, and its flavor and aroma that you can maybe recall in your mind. And you may recognize the aroma when you walk by Chinese street food stores. So this is maybe your understanding of soy sauce. But now let us look at how it is made. Making soy sauce. The basic procedure for making soy sauce may not be clear to everyone here. Most soy sauce today are made with soybeans or legumes with protein content, with or without grain flour. Grain flour provides the carbohydrate in the sauce. The procedure begins by boiling the beans until they are soft and to undergo fermentation. Often after mixing the beans with grain flour, the mixture is then allowed to incubate in a warm, clean, enclosed but ventilated room until a yellow-greenish mold develops on the surface. The fermented mixture is called qu. You can see the Chinese character there. And in English, this is better known as koji, which is the Japanese word for it. The qu is then put in salt or brine for its second stage of fermentation, in ceramic barrels in the Chinese case, and in huge wooden barrels in the Japanese case. This second fermentation usually takes months or even years, depending on the regional types. And in the China case, incubation is done under the sun during the hot weather. And in the Japanese case, it's indoor. At the end of the second fermentation, soy sauce is made after filtering. So that is the broad outline of the procedure. In scientific terms, the fermentation process breaks down the protein and carbohydrate of the legume and grain to generate amino acid and lactic acid that constitute the unique flavor of the sauce. Salt, used in the second stage of fermentation, provides another layer of flavor and sanitizes the fermenting mixture during the long period of incubation. That procedure looks rather simple and straightforward, but it's not as simple as it seems. The devils are all in the details. The quality of ingredients, the right proportions of qu and brine, the right moment to begin fermentation, temperature control during fermentation, brewing conditions and duration, the amount of stirring needed during incubation, and so on and so forth. All of these are embodied skill acquired only by experience. This process is fully explained in H.T. Huang's book published in 2000. A critical step in the procedure is the preparation of the fermented qu. Koji, if you like. The qu making procedure is one of the crafts described in Tiangong Kai Wu, a late Ming text, usually translated as the works of heaven and the inception of things. For this book, the making of qu in this text is for the preparation of liquor making. But the making of qu is similar for liquor making and in the making of soy sauce. The basic principle of making qu changed relatively little. The 17th century picture on the left and the 21st century photo on the right. The photo on the right shows the fermentation room in a soy sauce manufacturer in Hong Kong that I took. This shop is in the New Territories of Hong Kong. And the two shops show that fermentation rooms consist of wooden frames on which bamboo trays are put where the koji or the chu was being prepared or fermented. But today, the process is significantly shortened and stabilized by using a pure culture starter developed by Japanese biochemists in the 19th century called terikoji or zhongqu, or seed koji, a point that I will discuss again in my third lecture. So this is a very brief description of what soy sauce is and how it is made. Now, let me go to the second part of my talk on the process, on how soy sauce evolved from an elite food to a popular commodity. The earliest extant mention of jiangyou soy sauce, was found in Song text, the 13th century Song text, in elite recipe text. H.G. Huang had given substantial examples of those, so I won't repeat them here. But I think the more significant thing is the first extant record of the method of making soy sauce. It was not in one of the first agricultural treatises in China. The first mention of the method is by the iconic Yuan landscape painter by the name of Li Zan. I mean, for those of you, if you are familiar with Chinese art history, you will definitely know his name. A 14th century artist from a wealthy family, Jiangsu province. This portrait by his friend Zhang Yu depicts him as a well-off literati artist. He wrote a short recipe text that began with the method of making soy sauce, which is called jiangyou fa. Here I translate what he said as the method. He said, for every official pack of yellowish fermented beans, have ready 10 catties of salt and 20 catties of water on a hot summer day, mix them and incubate. Even though this is a very broad outline of the method without any detail, it does show that the knowledge and practice of making soy sauce was a shared knowledge, at least among the privileged class. However, 2 centuries later, in the late 16th century, the condiment was still not a popular condiment. Tian Yiheng, who is another literatus, a late Ming literatus from a prominent scholar official family in the Hangzhou region, wrote his famous daily jotting, published in the late 16th century, where he said, nowadays the wealthy make fermented soy sauce and pastes flavored with wolfberry or rose. So Ming wealthy families, they have rose soy sauce. While the common people in the countryside may not have many occasions of tasting even ordinary bean paste. Those who dwell in isolated mountains and forgotten valleys may never taste soy paste or soy sauce in their whole life. As for those who buy corrupted condiments infested with maggots in the marketplace, they are truly pitiable. His comments show that good soy sauce, quality soy sauce, was only enjoyed by the well-off classes, families, who made the sauce at home, and products sold in shops were mostly corrupt. However, the visibility of soy sauce was certainly increasing in literary genre, such as life-nourishing texts, the Yangsheng text, and Materia Medica, a 本草 text. In the iconic 本草纲目, systematic Materia Medica by Li Shizhen of the very late 16th century, soy sauce was described in some length more like a fine, delicious food than medicine, which it was also. The trend accelerated the trend of the visibility of soy sauce accelerated after the Manchu takeover in the mid-17th century. The increasing mentions of soy sauce in recipe books, independent of materia medica and life-nourishing genre, clearly shows the trend. Again, H.T. Huang was the first who counted the number of mentions of soy sauce in such recipe books that he could identify before our digital age, providing a clear trend of the growing use of soy sauce in elite diet, though the picture he painted was inevitably incomplete. The table he compiled indicates the rise of soy sauce as an everyday food from the late 17th century onward. If you look at this table, the top list is the names of soy condiments mentioned in the text, and the first column on the left is the list of texts that he used to count the mention of soy sauce of the condiments. And the fourth volume from the left, which I put within the frames, are the mentions of soy sauce, Jiao. And you could see that between the very first text and the 16th century text, there were very few, very sporadic mentions of soy sauce, and the number of mentions increased quite significantly after this late 17th century. His counting substantiates his claim that it was in the early Qing that soy sauce was finally, here he said, the most popular condiment in the Chinese food system, even though his counting does not reflect the full magnitude of the condiment's popularity in the Qing. Note the last two items the last two texts that he listed in the table, and that is 调鼎集, the harmonious cauldron. That is the translation of H.T. Huang, which is a huge compilation of anonymous recipe manuscripts, apparently initiated by a late 18th century sword merchant. The collection was expanded by various contributors throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, until it made its way into the hands of the chief librarian of the Peking Library, who wrote the preface for the compilation in the final version in 1928. H.T. Huang only counted the mentions of soy sauce in 2 of the 10 chapters of this huge compilation. And he counted something close to 200, already far exceeding all the previous counts added together. Actually, the total number of mentions of the 10 chapters of the 1928 compilation was almost 600. So you could see the significant increase of the mention of soy sauce in Qing and early Republican texts and recipes. Well, we are now in a digital age, and the digital databases allow us to check H.T. Huang's claim much more easily. The erudition old text database, the Guji database, I'm sure many of you have used it. And in that database include some 10,000 titles of texts of all genres, including philosophy, geography, history, literary writing, and so on and so forth. And that very useful database allow us to do some interesting counting of soy sauce. So I did a keyword search in that database, and I used the word jiao, soy sauce, and found a total of 275 mentions. 7 were pre-Qing, mostly in life nourishing and medical texts, while 208 of them are in Qing texts. The database, however, is far from complete. It does not include the above mentioned 调鼎集, the harmonious cauldron published in 1928, nor Qing Bai Li Chao, records of popular customs in the Qing, published in 1916, where information on soy sauce was abundant. Moreover, though the database shows the trend of soy sauce consumption, it tells us little about the trend of production. So what I did was a second keyword search in another database. In the erudition database, the gazetteer database consisting more than 4,000 titles throughout Chinese history. And I used another keyword, which is jiangfang, workshop or shops for making jiang condiments, alcohol, and so on and so forth. And very often we translate jiangfang as pickle shops. And these urban shops were specialized in making and selling fermented foods and drinks made with soy and various grains, such as oils, liquors, vinegars, pastes, and soy sauces. Soy sauce was usually the flagship product of these pickle shops. And what do I find? I found a total of 233 mentions, of which 26 appear in gazetteers published between 1796 and 1911, and 205 in those published between 1911 and 1949. Though a majority of the 205 described as of Qing origin. There is no mention of jiangyuan or jiangfang in pre-Qing gazetteers. So no, you can, in the gazetteers anyway, there was no jiangfang before the Qing. These statistics make it clear that soy sauce commodification took off in the late 18th century and accelerated at the turn of the 20th century. Again, although these figures indicate the trend of the growth of urban pickle shops in the period, they do not reflect the full magnitude of the phenomenon during the period. One major defect of a keyword search in this database is that each appearance of the word jiangfang or jiangyuan in a gazetteer is only counted once, even though the word is followed by the number of shots. Republican magazine, I mean, we had to use other sources to understand the situation better. So what I did was to use Republican magazines and commerce and industry, which provide more accurate counts of pickle shops in specific cities to give us a better idea. We know, for example, that by 1926, Beijing had more than 140 shops of different sizes, and that by 1933, Zhejiang province had 322 pickle shops, with 2 counties boasting more than 80 shops each, and the others having anywhere from a dozen to more than 50 shops. A survey published in Shanghai in 1936 included a list of 14 pickle manufacturers of different regional products. You have Ningpo soy sauce, Guangdong soy sauce, Haiyan soy sauce, and local Shanghai soy sauce that sold their products to local retailers called Caofang, of which there were more than 3,000 in Shanghai alone. This structure of several manufacturing pickle shops feeding a greater number of retail shops seems to be a model common in the Jiangnan region. So by the 19th century, leading pickle shops came to embody the essence of cities where they were established, such as on the left, we have Liu Biju, which you can still find in Beijing today. The shop was established in early Qing and famous for producing the best sauce in the capital and the best pickled vegetables in Beijing. It was run by professional Shanxi merchants who created an aristocratic image shop in the capital. You can see very clearly in the photo. Whereas Jiangyuan pickle shops in Shanghai, on the right, express the vigor of a bustling business hub. Pickle shops became major landmarks in Qing urban landscape, embodying the spirit of city life. The golden age of pickle shops was in the late 19th and 20th centuries. On average, pre-war pickle shops in Shanghai employed about 30 people, though some of the biggest shops in Beijing in the 1920s could employ up to 70 or 80 workers during peak seasons. These workers, exclusively men, as women were usually excluded from the production of fermented foods as they were considered potentially polluting. Came from these workers came from nearby regions, recommended by friends and relatives of the owners. The shops also employed artisans on a part-time basis to make the tools and instruments in wood, stone, and bamboo, etc., necessary for fermentation and manufacturing. The increasing scale and influence of pickle shops in cities resulted in the setting up of guilds to protect the business interest. The earliest pickle shop guilds, the Gongsuo, were set up since the early 19th century in southern cities, mostly like Hangzhou, Shanghai, and Chengdu. The one in Suzhou, set up in 1873 with 86 member shops, was one of the biggest. All these unquestionably point to the fact that soy sauce did become the most popular condiment by the High Qing. But the question remains, what triggered the rapid expansion of soy sauce commodification that began in the 18th century, given that its production methods and techniques had been known since at least the 14th century. H.T. Huang, trained first as a chemist and got himself interested in the history of Chinese fermentation, was the first to ask this question. He attributed the 4th century lag to the fact that the techniques of fermentation and manufacture were mostly orally transmitted, handed down from master to apprentice on the job, preventing a more rapid spread of the knowledge and practice of soy sauce making necessary for the wide commodification of the condiment. To this explanation, but as an old-fashioned historian, I tend to look for answers in the specific conjuncture of the Qing conquest of China that could have impacted the material aspect of soy sauce making. The changing availability of soybeans immediately comes into the picture. Soybean was the main ingredient for many Chinese traditional popular foods and also used as a fertilizer and a fodder. After all, soybean, known as shu, in ancient texts was one of the 5 major food crops in China. Market demand for soybeans had certainly existed since early times, but we have very little idea of and whether and how much that demand changed over time. Pickle shop phenomenon and the popularization of soy sauce provide a significant clue to this question. The emergence of pickle shops in the 18th century and the rapid expansion since then until the early 20th century in all parts of China are clear indication of profound changes that had little to do with technological change, because the technology had not changed significantly in this period. The key difference seems to be the unprecedented and continuous increase in soybean supply in the Chinese market, which was mostly the consequence of political decisions made by the Manchu state at several important historical junctures between its conquest of China in 1644 and its collapse in 1911. So that leads me to the second part of my talk today, and that is Manchuria soybeans and Qing political power. Manchuria, before the Qing conquest of China in 1644, was culturally and economically distinct from China proper. It was not an agricultural region, but mostly pastoral land and forests, where Georgian and Mongol nomads thrive on hunting, cattle rearing, gathering of forest products, fishery, and so on and so forth. There are quite a few recent works on the environment of Manchuria before and after the Qing, which would be very useful on this question, and I will not go into detail on those. Let's just focus on the beans. Yellow and black soybeans were indigenous crops, but produced in relatively small quantities, mostly used for fodder for horses and camels, and traditionally levied in kind as a land tax until the late 17th century. The situation changed with the Qing conquest, when Chinese immigrant peasants were allowed en masse to cultivate soybeans in Manchuria, and exporting the beans to China proper on unprecedented scale for big profits. Trace easily the progressive opening of Manchurian land for agricultural exploitation by Chinese peasants after 1644. The first Qing Emperor, Zhenji, quickly saw the need to develop agriculture in Manchuria to secure food provision for the population and the military units of the Manchu home base. In 1653, Zhenji announced the first edict to encourage the immigration of Chinese peasants to cultivate the vast Manchurian lands by providing them with loans in the form of grain and buffalo, 20 heads of buffalo for every 100 peasants. This announcement triggered the first wave of Chinese peasant immigration in Manchuria. The banner system that we all know, or at least we are aware of the system, designed by the Qing authorities, encouraged Chinese peasants to integrate Manchurian society and partially renounce their Chinese identity by abandoning foot binding for women and trade ventures for men, so that men and women could all focus on agriculture. In return, this Chinese bannermen would be granted access to low-tax agricultural land. Their main duty was to ensure food security for the banner society, including producing food for the military and fodder for draft animals. Since the Manchus, trained mostly as hunters and warriors, were generally not skilled nor dedicated peasants. At the same time, exportation of soybeans by maritime routes to China proper, was prohibited for fear of jeopardizing food security in Manchuria, and continued for a while even after the lifting of maritime trade ban by Kangxi in 1684. Only limited exportation via land routes and along the Grand Canal was allowed. These measures were strictly enforced when the scale of agriculture in Manchuria was still targeting self-sufficiency. And yet, Chinese peasants continue to move to Manchuria, at times illegally, drawn by the promise of cultivable land. Waves of fortune-seeking Chinese peasants, especially from nearby Zhili, today's Hebei province and Shandong province, moved into Liaodong, Manchuria, so that land under cultivation by Chinese immigrants between 1683 and 1734 increased eightfold, from slightly more than 300,000 mu to 2.6 million mu by the mid-18th century. Gradual lifting of the export ban on soybean maritime trade began in 1772, indicating that the Manchu state had by then become confident of the political control of China and no longer felt its existence being threatened, now that soybean production in the region had reached abundance. The appetite for soybean consumption in China proper, on the other hand, was quickly growing. It was this Chinese demand and not local need in Manchuria that spurred the increase in land cultivated by Chinese peasants. A total of 2.8 million mu by 1766, increasing to 3.6 million mu by 1784, a growth of more than 26% in 18 years. Much of the newly cultivated land was dedicated to soybean. The state soon changed policy to take advantage of the new additional value of this old ancient crop. Instead of limiting exports, it increased them and levied a tax. The policy provided the state with a substantial revenue of about 19 million silver taels in 1775. By 1780, soybean tax revenue had increased to 28,000 silver taels. In addition, soybean smuggling was rife. Meanwhile, Chinese immigration, legal and illegal, continued. One study estimates that by the end of the 19th century, there were at least 3 million Chinese peasants in southern Manchuria. The scale of Manchurian soybean commodification and exportation to China has been well studied, first by Japanese scholar Kato Shigeshi in the 1950s, followed by quite a few Chinese, Taiwanese, and American scholars. I don't have time to quote all of them. Just Christopher Isset in his 2007 book proposes the following figures. While the annual Manchurian soybean surplus was under 1.5 million shi, which is about 120,000 tons in the late 17th century, it increased to 3 million shi in the first half of the 18th century, topped 4 million shi in 1875, and reached 7 million in 1900. Estimated exports from Manchuria to China proper increased from 1 to 1.5 million shi in the late 18th century to 3 million in 1875 and more than 5 million by 1900. Clearly, this flood of soybeans in the Chinese market fueled the urban pickle shop phenomenon in China proper and made soy sauce into a daily commodity. Maritime soybean trade between Manchuria and China proper also led to the rise of Shanghai as a major seaport in the early 19th century, overtaking Suzhou as a canal port as the main trade route of Jiangnan. This history of Shanghai, development of Shanghai, the role of soybean trade in the development of Shanghai was well studied by the Chinese historian Fan Jingyi. Shanghai soybean traders formed their guild already in 1813 and became the most powerful guild in the city. The first wave of Chinese peasant immigration to southern Manchuria, beginning in the late 17th century, was a consequence of political decisions made by the first Qing emperors, who took the regime to its peak in the 18th century. But the second wave of Chinese immigration to northern Manchuria in the early 20th century was in part spurred by the rapid decline of the regime. By the early 20th century, Qing China had endured a series of devastating political and social crises, including the Opium War, the Taiping Rebellion, the defeat by Japan in 1895, and the Boxer fiasco in 1900. This series of catastrophes created huge foreign debts and insurmountable political pressure for the Qing dynasty. And the government resorted to selling Manchurian land to Chinese immigrants and issuing an open invitation to develop the region. As a result, Chinese immigration in Manchuria grew tenfold after 1850, from around 2.9 million to 21.6 million in 1910, with an annual increase of 300,000 during each of these 60 years. So you can see the increase of Chinese peasants into northern Manchuria in the early 20th century. So the second wave of immigration, opening up northern Manchuria for soybean cultivation, not only expanded the Chinese market, but also developed a new growing global market for the beans. Several studies since the 1980s by Chinese and American scholars have studied the emergence of Manchurian soybean as a global commodity in the final years of the Qing dynasty, when northern and Mongolian Manchuria, northern Manchuria means Mongolian Manchuria, including Jilin and Heilongjiang provinces. They were forced open for further economic exploitation. The region would produce 4/5 of the soybeans exported from Manchuria in the early 20th century. The Japanese gained control of the Southern Manchurian Railway in 1906, and this takeover, along with the opening of more treaty ports in Manchuria, heralded the beginning of the global trade in Manchurian soybean, in which Japan and Europe soon replaced China as the biggest market. From this point, Manchuria soybean production reached new peaks, first in 1908 to 1915 in southern Manchuria, again in 1916 to 1934 in northern Manchuria, reaching 4 million tons in 1933. Let me now go to the third and last part of my talk, which is about soy sauce commodification and the full Manchuria-China integration. To understand the full significance of Manchurian soybean in China's economic, political, and cultural history, we have first to realize the long-standing soybean shortage in China proper. That shortage was finally alleviated by Manchurian beans and its export. So I look at some of the trend, the situation of the shortage is a little bit difficult to follow, but I think we can more or less trace the trend since the second half of the 18th century. A memorial issued in 1763 by the Governor General of Fujian Zhejiang province by the name of Yang Tingzhang was one of the first indication of soybeans shortage in China. He explained in his memorial, here I translate part of his memorial. He said, yellow soybeans are used by the people in Zhejiang province in making jiang condiments, doufu, vegetarian dishes, and as fodder for horses. There is huge demand, but Zhejiang soybean production is inadequate, and the amount received from Fengtian, Manchuria, is small. That was at the very beginning of the cultivation of soybeans by Chinese peasants in Manchuria. But those beans do not, because of the ban of exportation, very little of that production reached Zhejiang. And even when it reached Zhejiang, it does not reach all counties. So Yang Tingzhang pleaded for direct maritime shipments of soybeans from Shandong province in hope that the trade would bring down the price of the beans. So beans were very expensive in Zhejiang. This would be greatly beneficial to the livelihood of the people in the province. Yang's memorial indicates the huge market demand for the crop and its high price due to the serious shortage in one of the most prosperous provinces. The difficult access to Manchurian beans in his time was the main cause of his frustration and motivation for his plea to the emperor. And when we look at much later evidence, we can see that trend remain the same, more or less the same, increasing supply of Manchurian soybeans in the Chinese market did not entirely solve the problem of shortages of the legume, especially in southern provinces. As stated in the 1942 report on Zhejiang, here, this is an article on the Zhejiang situation. Soybean produced in the province is not sufficient even for local consumption. The situation was more clearly spelled out in the 1936 land survey of a county in Zhejiang, Pingwu County. It says soybean took up only 8% of cultivated land after rice, rape, broad bean, and grass. Although this amount was already a significant increase over the past, legume was not even mentioned in earlier records. The dozens of pickle shops in the county required soybeans far in excess of what local production could provide. They had no choice but to rely heavily on cheaper imported Manchurian beans. The same situation is reported in Guangdong province in the early 1930s. Here I quote another article published in the 1930s. Guangdong province has a huge demand for soybeans to make fermented condiments, sprouts, cakes, and other foodstuffs. The importance is only second to rice, but the soybean production of the entire province is not sufficient to make sprouts, even for just Canton City. Increasingly, we have to rely on Manchurian beans that cost us 40 million yuan a year. 90% of soybeans consumed in Guangdong come from Manchuria. The need of soybeans specifically for making soy sauce, as opposed to other uses, can be estimated by using data from one of the biggest soy sauce consuming provinces, Jiangsu, in the 1930s. According to a 1936 report, the province produced a total of 562 million kilos of soybean that year, but it needed 629 million kilos, implying a shortage of 66.8 million kilos. The amount needed to make soy sauce was about 70 million kilos. This is calculated from the per capita soy sauce consumption that year, which was about 9 kilo per capita for the urban population and about 4 kilo for the rural population. The amount needed was about 10% of the 629 million kilos needed by the province, and greater than the 67 million kilo that the report noted as the gap between local production and the total demand that year. China, in Guangdong province, where soybean production was tiny, as I just said, the production of soybeans in the whole province is not sufficient to produce sprouts for just Canton City. Manchurian beans actually gave birth to soy sauce manufacturers in the early 20th century in Guangdong. Soy sauce making reached small towns such as this manufacturer in a town called Xinan. This town was about 80,000 population, 50 miles southwest of Canton. A study of this shop in 1919 by Elizabeth Groff, who was the sister of the dean of School of Agriculture at Canton Christian College, which was later called Leung University. She confirms that the soybean used in the production there were the best yellow beans from Niuzhuang, Manchuria. They are called golden beans, slightly smaller than the American soup beans. In the 1920s and 30s, only the Manchuria region in China, which produced 45% of China's total, was in surplus of soybean production. The rest of China were in shortage. Taken together, these snippets of information sketch a longitudinal picture of soybean as a crop that, though grown almost everywhere in China, was never plentiful enough to meet local needs in China proper, except in the northern plains. This explains that soy sauce remained a luxury condiment until the late Ming, and as the limited supply of soybeans prevented it from being widely commodified or even used at home. The beans that were available were instead used to make substantial soy foods such as tofu, oil, sprouts, fertilizer, fodder. And soy sauce is not a food necessity, so it was low on the priority of its use. The emergence of Manchurian soybean on the Chinese market in the late 18th century led to a widespread upsurge in soy sauce production, and the new consumption patterns created more market needs. Rapidly increasing production and trade volumes also reduced the cost of soy foods, making them more affordable. Over more than a century, this process unleashed the huge potential of the legume as a food crop, a condiment that for centuries had been reserved only for the privileged classes who made the sauce at home. Now it was widely available in urban shops, becoming the most popular Chinese condiment. So that was my answer to H.T. Huang's question. Soybeans not only made China dependent on Manchuria for its economy and daily dietary needs, it also turned Manchuria into the land of hope for many devastated Chinese peasants. A popular trope in the late Qing was the peasant underdog from Shandong, Hebei, and later from southern China, achieving wealth and status by migrating to Manchuria to grow crops. I quote a 1918 article: "Many who could not make a living at home in Zhili and Shandong provinces, scorned by their friends and neighbors and abandoned by the families, migrated to Liaodong and became rich by cultivating land." Manchuria, however, was not a ready market for soy sauce in the early and mid-Qing. The Chinese peasant immigrants who grew the crops were not encouraged to engage in commerce by the early Manchu state, and they were not experienced in turning their production skills into lucrative businesses. As a result, pickle shops were slow to arrive in Manchuria despite the ready availability of the materials needed. But changes came when the entire Manchurian region was forced to open to the rest of China and the world. A Japanese survey of the soy sauce business in 1910 in Fengtian, in southern Manchuria, provides a bird's eye view of the pickle shop development in Manchuria. Here I quote the article. "The use of soy sauce slowly increased here. 10 years ago, so at the beginning of the 20th century, there was no soy sauce in Fengtian, as people just used salt. Pickle shops businessmen from Tianjin introduced the condiment here, and in 10 years, the increase was significant, indicating the social progress made." I think that is a very important sentence, that the emergence of soy sauce in a city represents social progress. Here, the price of soy sauce is high, and makers cater to high society and upscale hotels, but the production will gradually increase. There were 43 shops 2 years ago, and last year the number increased to 54. And this year we have 63, showing the rapid growth of the business. The soy sauce business is mainly run by Tianjin businessmen. For the Japanese observer, the emergence of pickle shops in Fengtian indicated that social or cultural progress represented by city lifestyle was finally reaching Manchuria. The successful cultivation and commodification of soybeans was beginning to turn Manchuria into a part of civilized China. Soy sauce sold by pickle shops introduced by Shanghai and Tianjin merchants completed the process. About 20 years later, in 1929, Fengtian claimed an indigenous style of soy sauce which was different from the sweeter southern source, from China proper. The commodification of this salty northern-style condiment, described as indigenous in the local gazetteers, made only with fermented black bean bricks without grain flour, was a key moment in the integration of Manchuria into cultural China. The popularization of soy sauce, made possible by ample supplies of Manchurian soybeans, not only reached the southern frontier of China in Guangdong province, as we have just seen, but had also come full circle, reaching Manchuria itself. And with that, this region was fully Sinnicized. So I will end the talk today, and tomorrow I shall go into more detail on the cultural power of soy sauce in my next lecture. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you, thanks Mark, thanks Dinda for inviting me to offer some thoughts on Professor Angela Leung's first Reischauer lecture, and thank you Angela for this work. It's been an education and an honor. So this is likely a particularity of my, how I say, academic upbringing, having been advised in graduate school by the great Qing historian, Mark Elliott, or the historian of the Great Qing. You know, I can think of very few questions in the history of East Asia that are, you know, more compelling, more fascinating than the Manchu, how the Manchu conquest and rule changed China. Well, the most obvious and enduring way was through the territorial conquest that left revolutionaries and republicans in 1912 with a multi-ethnic empire more than twice the size of the preceding Ming dynasty that they and their successors would squeeze into the form of a nation state. And there was, over the course of the 18th century, the doubling of the population, which many have taken to be both a sign of a prosperous society and a factor that would contribute to its decline in the century that followed. Now, today, through the case of soy sauce that Professor Leung has presented, we've been offered another way to look at that question. Now, the 18th century was, as many have shown and some have really stressed, a period in which many people enjoyed greater access to stuff, through the active circuits of inter-regional trade and the prodigious production of all manner of commodities. Now, within that broader context, the story then that you tell, Angela, of soy sauce transforming from this elite condiment to an everyday food may not be so surprising. However, the manner that it did and that you have so nicely detailed for us is notable. Now, as someone who has spent some time studying the history of Manchuria in the 20th century, I appreciated from early on just what a big deal soybeans were. After all, for the powerful Japanese colonial corporation that was the South Manchuria Railway Company, the coal that I wrote about was only eclipsed by the soybean as the enterprise's most profitable product for decades. Exported to China itself, Europe, Japan, the US, most notably as a fertilizer, the bacteria that's typically in symbiosis with this legume's roots were especially effective at fixing to the soil the nitrogen that plants need to grow. And maybe this is another particularity of someone who works on a commodity that you get really invested in its rise and fall. But the sort of increased use of coal in Manchuria in the early 20th century was also benefited, or the increase had been spurred by the soybean industry, and this is largely because a lot of the fields were were formerly, let's say, sorghum growing fields that were turned over to soybean cultivation, and sorghum was one of these fuels, biofuels that were used to heat towns. Folks turned to coal, which was also had their prices suppressed for industrial purposes as well, and so this kind of this relationship between soybean and coal was something I was noting as I was doing my own work. But I also know, and you cited here, thanks to the work of economic historians like Kato Shigeshi and Chris Bissett, and more recently Richard Evans as well, who has this really, really terrific dissertation from the University of Wisconsin-Madison on this topic. The Manchurian soybean has this deeper history. Over the 2.5 centuries of Qing rule, the court went back and forth on this question of Han agrarian settlement in southern Manchuria, first encouraging it in the interest of increasing the area's food supply, then ostensibly, banning further migration when there were these official complaints about landscape transformation amidst this growing sentiment for imagined Manchu homeland that was sort of disrupted by this cultivation, then closing an eye to continued migration that provided labor for the production of cash crops that helped short the beleaguered manorial system. And you've talked a little bit about this. And amid all of this, the soybean industry expanded with soybeans and notably also soybean cakes flowing mainly out of the port of Yingkou to the southern parts of the empire, beginning in the second half of the 18th century. Now, what you've put forward here, Angela, is this interesting parallel case to that of soybean cakes, which has oftentimes linked to the question of agricultural productivity and raising agricultural productivity in fields that were increasingly overtaxed and depleted as they were used to, had to produce more and more food to feed a growing population, a swelling population. This parallel case here with soybeans serving not only as fertilizer, feedstock, or a source of oil, but also supplying the expansion of the soy sauce industry. And with that, that's a particular transformation of taste. Now, I think this is important in part because when thinking and writing about food in Chinese history, the general tendency among social and economic historians, and I'm painting with a really broad brush here, has been a focus on questions of staple grains, particularly in the workings of the agrarian economy. And this is important. I acknowledge that it's really important because one of the biggest challenges of our present, as it was in the past in China and elsewhere, is how we feed ourselves, how we feed the hungry in our societies. Still, if we do not also acknowledge that food has been, for many, more than just a question of sustenance, we may lose sight of industries like the soy sauce industry that have been a key cultural and economic institutions, and at the very least tells us something about a particular sort of elemental dimension of our human experience. I would now like to just widen the frame a little bit, Angela, because of this multi-year project that you had mentioned that you had led on making modernity in East Asia, which took the region as a whole, both as subject of study and following Takeuchi Yoshimi and others as method. Now, while this may not be within the scope of the book you're writing, centered as it is on China, I understand that over the course of the research, you looked at the soy sauce industry elsewhere within the region. And I was wondering if I could invite some comparative and maybe some connective comments. As you know, some of these cultures had long produced soy sauce and other soybean products. In Korea, the kanjang, the soy sauce, and the doenjang being sort of a soybean paste being traced to around the 9th century, or the gochujang, the spicy red pepper paste that's sort of all the rage on Food Network TV shows nowadays to the 17th century after the introduction of red peppers from the Americas. And many of these soybean products were, these accounts were primarily made at the level of the household. And then, you have also these really old soy sauce breweries in places like Japan. I think that the earliest one I found, or the one that's still in operation, is one in Fukui, which dates its founding to 1573, so during the Sengoku period. So, wondering if and how this dynamic that you just then described in the Chinese case, from elite food to everyday condiment, played out in these other places, even if their timelines may not be quite the same. What was particular to the Chinese case that made this development seem, and I risk sounding deterministic here, so late? Was it an issue of population size and distribution, a distinguishing characteristic that often finds itself used as an explanatory variable in the Chinese case? Was it these competing uses for soybeans, particularly a soybean oil or soybean cake, or to make tofu, for instance? Or might there have been, and I'm speculating here, earlier instances of more widespread home brewing in China or parts of China, as in Korea, but not the emergence of what you've shown today, this kind of popular commodity that's manufactured and marketed by these pickle shops from the mid-18th century onward, this kind of commodification of this product. And finally, I have just I'll wrap up with something brief over here, but as I was reading the paper that you had shared, and preparing this remarks, I went back to the anthropologist Sidney Mintz's classic Sweetness and Power, in which he talks about sugar and how it becomes a similar sort of shift also from this luxury good to what we might think of as a necessity in our sort of industrial modern lives. And he pays a lot of attention to both how this was also sort of predicated on the large plantation economy. And I appreciated what you have said, and I do want, although I do hope that you would say more in the final version, perhaps about the work and labor that went into the popularization of soy sauce. You talked about the migrant laborers to Dongbei, the laborers and the artisans in these jiangfang, and so in between these, you also have tons of workers who are doing the transportation. And maybe this is anticipating the next lecture, but I wonder if you could say more about the extent to which soy sauce then shaped these particular worlds of work and labor for those who ended up consuming it as an everyday product. And I'll end here. I'll end here with a quote from Mitz, which I think which sort of inspired me to sort of ask a question along those lines. And I'm quoting here: "Food may be no more than a sign of yet larger, more fundamental processes. Also, it seems diet is remade because the entire productive character of societies is recast, and with it, the very nature of time, of work, and of leisure." And so with that, I'll end my comments, and I look forward to our discussion.
I think we'll take the questions and I'll respond together.
Sure. Angela suggested that we take questions from the audience and then she'll answer those together. We have two microphones here, so if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to either queue at one of the microphones, or we can bring the microphone over to you if that's easier as well. So if you have a question, if you could just raise your hand, identify yourself, particularly for those online who may not. So please start.
Peter Bull, so thank you very much. I was wondering if you could say something about where the various products, edible products made from soy, fit in the Chinese diet in this period, how that changed. In particular, tofu, because it would seem that tofu, in some sense, as a vehicle for protein, really essential. And so, if there's a shortfall in soybean, they're also beginning to be a real problem with tofu, or is tofu not that important? So maybe this is asking for a whole book about tofu too. So thank you.
So, Andrew, thanks so much. And as a historian of the Great Qing, I make no claims of the other sort. I'm always happy to take or on the Manchu's behalf claim for all the great things that they did for China, and I hadn't known that soy sauce was going to be one of those. But can I ask? I mean, one of the things you cite this official from the Qianlong period, Yang Mingzhang. We know that Qing officials were out there all the time talking about agricultural policy. They were very much involved in promoting the cultivation of many different kinds of products, or discouraging the cultivation of other kinds of products. So, tobacco, for instance, when the cash economy really starts to take off, everyone wants to grow tobacco. We can't eat tobacco, so officials are out there discouraging that with qualified success. Given the persistent shortages of the growth of soybeans everywhere in the empire. I do wonder if you've run across more evidence of officials trying and maybe failing to encourage people to grow it more. And if you're not seeing that, then I kind of wonder why not? Because it's not as though officials were shy about trying to promote various sorts of various kinds of they had a very keen understanding of the market, and I would have expected there to be more of a sustained effort to try and promote that. So if that part of the story, if anything you could share on that, I'd be super interested to hear.
Take the two first.
Okay. For Peter's question, somebody asked me that question before. As you said, we will need another book on that, and I can't answer that question on the how the history of consumption or production of tofu. But I think one thing is clear, that when you have so much soybeans, then people, I mean the shops would prefer to make tofu first, because it's a more valuable product for them to make. But I cannot tell, I mean, there's no indication on the changing production trend or consumption trend of tofu compared to soy sauce. But as you see, only 10% of soybean use is used to make soy sauce. So the 90% is used for other things. And I guess the use of soybeans as a menu or as a fodder has always been important. And I think soy foods, soybean, soy sauce, tofu pea, and all of that came later. And of all the foods, I think tofu is the most important. As you said, it's very rich in protein, and it's an important food. So soy sauce making is not a priority for production. And so so when it became the most popular condiment, and it's seen as the most important condiment, everybody thought that it's been, it's part of Chinese civilization. Everyone used soy sauce. It means that soybean has to be produced on such a scale that it is possible to be used that way. And so the function of soy sauce, the use of soy sauce, I will explain a little bit more in my next lecture. And whereas for the other foods, it's really for a food of substance. And soy sauce is a luxury. For Mark's question, I have not seen any officials encouraging people's cultivating soybeans. Soybeans usually is cultivated as a kind of a gap crop, something that you grow between two rice crops, for example, because it will fertilize the soil. And the why is that? Why did the Chinese bureaucrats why did they not encourage people to grow more soybeans? Is a $1 million question. I don't know. If you look at the documents, text articles in the 20th century, you would, as some of those I have quoted today, what was I going to say? Let's check that. Huh? Okay, it will come back to me. I'm a bit in a mood of jet lag. Yeah.
Thank you, Angela.
Hi,
Fascinating, and it's wonderful to see you here.
Wonderful to see you here. Yes, yes.
With everybody. everybody as well. Let me say, oh yes, I believe that it's been some time since I had grain price lists. Many of the grain price lists do give prices for Aldo or Huangdo for different kinds of beans. This can certainly track prices on the market. I think that the official discouragement of uses of grains focused on processed grains. They were upset by processing grains like rice and wheat into alcohol, of course. That diverted from the roots, which really should be the grain itself. I haven't seen that for soybean, but it would be consistent that they would not pay attention or not particularly want the use of soybeans to be something that was a processed luxury product rather than a basic grain itself. That's just a comment, I suppose, not a question. But the second question would be about regional varieties. Well, many cuisines have many regional varieties, and you did mention some variation between North and South. So when or how do these different regional varieties in soybean production now appear?
The soybean varieties are huge in China. There was the surveys done in the 20th century, in the 1970s. They show thousands and thousands of breeds, and usually the soybean breeds that were most favorable for making soy sauce were southern beans. Being the biggest number of varieties were found in the Jiangnan region. Actually, it's not the Manchurian region, and the most expensive beans used for soy food making are not Manchurian but southern beans. But these were in part of the reason why they were expensive is because they were produced not in great quantity. They were in small quantities, but their values is not in oil or as a manual or anything, but it's considered the best ingredient for making foods like tofu, fermented bean curds, and soy sauce. And they have names. I have a whole chapter on soybeans in the book, but it was in the second part of my book. It is about the memory of soybean as a crop. They have names. They have specific qualities. During as late as the late Qing, people still remember by the names, but now many of them have become extinct. And Manchurian beans became the universal breeds because they were studied more systematically by scientists.
We'll take one last question over. So take one final question. We do have 2 more days, so please, we'll have a chance.
This sort of and perhaps have you see if you could say something. There's many different types of sauces, as you obviously know, but given the close relationship between fermentation processes that work with for fish, and breaking down of enzymes, eating starch and rice and salt to produce a fish sauce, if you could, if you started off your talk in the supermarket aisles with soy sauce, but if we walk down a different supermarket aisle, we run into ketchup, and which is basically that fish sauce, which travels all the way, mostly through Southeast Asia, ends up in Europe, gets sugar added to it and becomes ketchup. So is there a different story to be told for Southern China that's perhaps at this lower level that's not making its way into the kind of text that we're seeing here, that is a different type of a sauce that's spreading there, and why does soy sauce sort of win out, or is there, what kind of relationship between the, say, fish sauce and soy sauce, I guess, is the
Well, according to Ishige, as I said, he thinks that soy sauce defines East Asia. It's, East Asia, of course, is a huge region, and Japanese soy sauce and Chinese soy sauce and Korean soy sauce are not the same. Not the same taste, and they are not made exactly the same way. And the consumers realize what kind of, a Shanghai consumer will make the difference between a Shanghai sauce and a Cantonese sauce and a northern sauce. And whereas the fish sauce, according to Ishige, defines Southeast Asia as a region. So for the regional differences in soy sauce, there was a lot of details in Qing texts on the differences, and in one of my chapter, I explain how these regional differences turn soy sauce into identity food. And it identified not only a province, a region, a city, but a home, a place. So, but that idea only emerged after Manchurian beans became available, because Manchurian beans and making a soy sauce became a kind of a generic product. And when you make soy sauce with a specific local beans with a local name, that product has a particular identity. And that phenomenon came much later in the 19th century. And that people don't talk about these regional differences earlier.
Angela, just wanted, before we close, to invite you to see if you had any additional comments on Victor's comments, particularly looking at differences in production patterns and the lateness of large-scale Chinese production compared to Japan or Korea or elsewhere in the East Asia region.
I'm not sure that the large scale production of soy sauce in Korea, in Japan, were earlier than in China. I mean, could you give me some evidence of that large? Because Japanese soy sauce also rely heavily on Manchurian soybeans.
Yes, they do. But you also have these soy brewers that have been sort of in operation for quite a while. I mean, not to say that it, as the same level, it's a sort of society-wide phenomenon, but it's also part of their national narratives. Wondering whether it's not the Manchu conquest that sort of transforms the way in which soy sauce becomes such an important part of, or soy products also become such an important, fermented soy products of Korean and Japanese cuisines, and so yes, now I was just sort of opening up a potential kind of comparison if you had some comments on that, because the variable that you've introduced here was the Manchu conquest for the Chinese case, and the stories that some of these societies tell themselves is that it's also, I mean, maybe not 3,000 years, but pretty long histories of that, and how I just want to hear you think about on these, since you've sort of done some exploratory.
Well, I would like to look more closely at the Japanese and Korean case to compare. I'm not quite sure that the difference is that significant. I think it depends on how that production was being presented. And the amount, I mean, we need to have some data, some figures on the amount produced to make that comparison, right?
Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking Angela for very provocative first days worth of lectures, and please join us again tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. for lecture number 2, which is on the power of everyday malleable food. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.